All righty, it looks like we are recording. I want to take this time, Brendan, to thank you for being with me and everybody out there. This is Brendan Ellis Williams, and he is a very remarkable man. We had a conversation the other day where he allowed me just to pry into the depths of his mind and life experience, and I was wildly impressed, especially with a lot of his perspectives and level of commitment to his own spiritual development. And Brendan, I have to say, that was even more impressive to someone in your skin tone. Or as someone in your skin tone. So I also, in that conversation, put my foot in my mouth and said, and I won't even say what I said, but I opened with some things that were raw on my chest, and Brendan was so gracious to be able to handle them with love and care. And so I'd like you guys to know Brendan the same way that I do. So Brendan, will you please tell us about you and how impressive you are?
Well, thank you very much for having me, Alexis. And I'm happy to continue the conversation with you in this format. So, yeah, I'm an Episcopal priest. I'm also a Druid revival priest in a community called the Ancient Order of Druids in America. And I'm leader of a vowed religious community within the Episcopal Church. I'm a writer, so I have a book that was just recently published called Seeds from the Wild Verge. And I'm kind of just overall a longtime student and practitioner of mysticism, particularly Western mysticism, and of my own ancestral traditions of Gaelic and Brythonic or Welsh culture. And I also am a traditional healer. I'm a certified clinical Western herbalist, and I do traditional healing practice that's rooted in herbalism, but also just more broadly in my ancestral traditions of healing. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
That is not it, y'all. But so one of the things there's many things Brendan educated me on, but will you tell me or tell us about the different kinds of Catholic priests and what does it mean to be an Episcopal priest and how you're a cool Catholic and not necessarily a not cool Catholic?
Right. Well, I wouldn't necessarily frame it in those terms, but you're more than welcome to.
That's how I put my foot in my mouth, y'all.
No. So basically Catholic Christianity as a descriptor is a really broad term, and most people in America just think, when they hear the word Catholic, they think of Roman Catholic, just because that's how it's kind of fallen out in our particular cultural milieu here. It's become a colloquial term that refers mostly to Roman Catholics. But the reality is that Catholic Christianity is a hugely broad spectrum. And there are Eastern Rite Catholics, even the whole of the Eastern Orthodox world would be technically considered Catholic. And then there are Anglicans who broke away from Rome in the 16th century, and that's the tradition that I'm ordained in. So that's where the Episcopal Church comes from. So we're Catholics. Sometimes people will say, oh, small c Catholic versus capital C Catholic, but I don't necessarily even think that's really necessary or helpful. We're all Catholic Christians in one expression or another. In other words, we're all part of this long, 2,000-year-old roughly apostolic tradition. And it has many colors and many cultural expressions. So I'm just in one of those little branches.
So you mentioned that you have the Western mysteries and how does Jesus play out in all that?
This is the $10,000 question that church people always, actually, I'm never quite sure if they're eager to ask me or they're hesitant to ask me. Maybe it's a little bit of both. Some of them might be afraid of what my answer is going to be.
Because some of the stuff you mentioned, like you're an herbalist and you mysticism, And
Yeah.
the kind of Christianity that I grew up in, that's witchcraft.
Right.
You do
Right.
that, even though it's all through the Bible.
Yeah.
So, and just so
Totally.
y'all know, I'm totally okay with all of that stuff. Call me a witch if you like. But
Yeah.
so yeah, how does the homie Jesus play out?
Yeah. So, well, I think it's actually really helpful to distinguish between Jesus and Christ. And normally those two words are conflated. That was St. Paul's kind of conceit in his writing. But the historical Jesus is a notoriously enigmatic figure that we actually, from a scholarly perspective, know very, very little about, surprisingly little about. There's not a whole lot we can say about the historical Jesus that has, let's say, a notable veracity about it. But Christ is more the mythic dimension that was overlaid onto this historical or pseudo-historical figure, which was part of the process of the birthing of Christianity as a religion, which Paul was very integral in. And really, Christ is this notion of a kind of cosmic wisdom, a divine wisdom, that in some way was born incarnated on the earth in this person of Jesus, at least in an Orthodox Christian context. That's how it would be understood. But we could say more broadly or more cosmically, if you wish to use that term, Christ is the Divine Sophia, which is this Greek word which means wisdom. The same word that shows up in the word philosophy as we have it in English, philosophia, the love of wisdom. And that wisdom was personified, and particularly through, I won't go into all this historical stuff, but particularly through the Hellenistic Egyptian milieu that grew up in Alexandria, in Egypt. That figure of divine wisdom was essentially transposed as a feminine figure, by the way, which is an important piece, was transposed onto this figure of Jesus, Yeshua, the Nazarene, by Paul and others who were framing Christianity initially as a mystery tradition. It was like, you have in the ancient Greek world the cult of Isis, the cult of Mithras, the mysteries at Eleusis, these different expressions of what are broadly called mystery traditions or mystery religions. And Christianity, in its advent, was one of those mystery traditions. It was a new mystery religion that Paul and others put together, I think probably to speak to a Hellenistic Jewish audience, and to kind of make a bridge between Judaism, which was increasingly dispersing into the classical world, and the culture of Greece and Rome, and asking how do these things interplay, how do they interact, and there's all kinds of stuff that was drawn from the ancient Egyptian mysteries are hugely featured in the origins of Christianity. So a lot of people just don't know this. So when I think about Christ, that's what I'm thinking about, right? And that's what I'm orienting toward, not necessarily an idea that somebody commonly might have about an historical figure named Jesus who walked around and did all kinds of miracles and then died in order to redeem all of our wrong behavior. That's really not what it's all about.
Saying, Brenda, you don't sound like any priest I've met before. Right. That was not that, like, of the Catholic, any Catholic Christian, any of that. Like, you're the first white person I've met that taught me that history. Mm-hmm. I've heard a lot of it before, and I cannot recount it, even though you just said it. Mm. But even like bringing in Egypt, and I only hear that from Black people who are trying to empower me to my truth. Yeah. So it is very heartwarming to hear that from you. Tell me more.
I'm glad. Thank you. What a beautiful stream of empowerment that is, though, right? Like, to be able to connect back to those real roots in the Christian tradition. I mean, that's a really beautiful thing in all respects for all people. But I'm really glad to hear that you've been in cultural scenarios or circles where that discourse is unfolding. I mean, I'm really happy to hear that, because in the white Christian world, it's really not unfolding.
No.
In fact, it's this kind of having these kinds of conversations in the mainline institutional context that I am connected to, though I don't necessarily play in it at this particular moment. But I'm still connected to that institution, and this kind of discourse causes problems, so I'm,
because I've never heard this from you, like from anyone, and that was white, and like it never in any Christian church I've been in. In my Unity church, we do talk about the Christ power separate from Jesus, so there is that awareness. Hold on one second. Sorry.
Okay.
We do talk about the Christ power separate from Jesus, but it's not like you just explained it. That, like, how did you find this out? And how did you exist in your world or in the church with this understanding?
Yeah, two great and complicated questions. So how I found all this out, essentially, the short answer is a lot of years of really intensive study and research and looking to all the material that's available, especially the material that's not in the broad culture, that's not represented on the surface. And there is a lot of it. And this is one thing that I think people who aren't involved in scholarship don't, there's sort of a door that can be closed to folks outside the academy with regard to some of this material. And I think that's deeply unfortunate. And one of my hopes and aims is to bring some of this material that is more obscure, that's kind of behind closed doors, out into the broader public and into church discourse and into the culture in general. So just a lot of years of study and looking critically at the material that's available and reflecting on it and writing on it and having conversations like this one with lots of intelligent people who are also interested in these questions and who want to ask deep questions about the roots of things and about the roots of our inherited cultures, etc. And as far as how I've survived in the church, having this knowledge or taking these viewpoints, I think there are many ways to answer that question. I mean, on the one level, Catholic Christianity, again, broadly speaking, actually does contain a lot of beautiful threads of these early traditions that are maintained almost in spite of the institution. It's like they've been smuggled through time in these boats of institutional domination. And inside the hull of the boat, there's still all these little gems of beauty. There's beauty in the liturgy, there's beauty in the sacraments, there's beauty in the mysticism, which is not generally talked about much in the normative church, but it's there, it's part of the tradition. So there's a way in which I've just focused on that all these years, and just my teaching and my spiritual direction and the work that I've done as a priest is really about drawing people who are ready, because certainly not everyone's ready, but drawing people, yeah, but sifting out those souls that are ready and saying, look over here, look at all this depth that's here, and let's navigate that, let's explore that together. And here are some practices that can transform your perception and bring you into an experiential awareness of these truths. Because just to have the intellective awareness, the academic knowledge by itself isn't really very significant. It's fun, but it's really not going to get you there, so to speak. And so leading people into the experiential knowledge of these things is really my passion. And the church, even though I'm at odds with it in a lot of ways, it's been a beautiful vehicle for me to inhabit, to pull out these folks, that I come across who are ready, and then to guide them into a process of real transformation. So that's been a huge gift, and it's actually worked quite well in that respect for me.
Oh, there's so much in there. I have so many lanes of questions I want to ask.
Good, that's great.
So when you say ready for the experiential knowledge, while I feel somewhat more versed in the experience than the knowledge for my own awakening, tell us more about that and what that would look like, and then why you believe that's necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I mean by experiential knowledge is essentially what the word mysticism actually connotes. Mysticism points to what we would call in philosophical speak an experiential epistemology, which just means it's a way.
Bring it down.
I'll define it. It's a way of pursuing truth that's rooted in our own direct immediate experience, rather than inheriting it from a text or from somebody's mouth, right? So rather than saying, for example, what often happens in Christianity, which in my book I really rail against because I think this is a huge problem, is people say, well, we have these texts that are, that have been translated 10,000 times and they're in English now, which has almost no relationship to the original languages in any meaningful sense. But we have all the answers. So I know the truth now because the King James version told me so, right? That whole
everything trope is in the Bible.
Yeah, right. So
all right, that's what it's like in Black church.
Yeah. So that's one common approach. And what the experiential or mystical approach does is say, no, let's leave that aside. And instead, let's take up practices that we can do internally in ourselves that will change our vision and our way of perceiving enough that we might actually get close to some kind of deep insight on our own terms and not need to take a kind of half-assed version of it, if you will, from a text or from somebody who read a text and thinks that because they read that text and studied it, that they know what's happening in the universe. You know what I mean? So it's really about distilling all that stuff away so that we get to an essence or a kernel of direct personal revelation, which comes through changing our perception.
So now now you said all that to speak my language. Mm-hmm. You get to perceive the knowledge instead of just know the knowledge. Yeah. And from that perceiving of the knowledge, you get the experience of living in the knowledge.
Yes. Yeah. And in fact, I would say that's one way we could distinguish knowledge from wisdom. Wisdom, in my view, is something that arises from a lot of lived, deep experience. Whereas knowledge, in the way we ordinarily use that term anyway, is basically just intellective data that's been stored in our memory. And that can come from anywhere, any source. And who knows how much of that is garbage and how much of it is useful and how much of it, I mean, you can sift it out and make some discernments about that over time. But I think wisdom is really the aim, and in the spiritual life at least, which I equate to the core meaning and purpose of human life in general. That's just my personal approach. But wisdom really is about direct experience that's then integrated into who we are, and it becomes part of how we live every day.
Yes, I like that, the how we live. So I'm going to take that point to really get into the juicy meat of why I want people to hear what you have to say. Not that all that wasn't fabulous, but so what is your work and allyship? How do those things go together? And I am asking you about ancestry.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that's really important in a process of getting whole or healing, in a process of restoration, which is what we're all deeply in need of right now on the whole planet, but especially in America and in Western societies. A huge part of that, I think, is understanding where we come from and the dynamics historically, even metaphysically, that have led us to where we are. And getting in touch with our ancestry means, at one level at least, it means accessing the genetic and epigenetic content that's been passed down to us, and finding out what's there, and finding out, are there things that we need to heal? Almost every lineage in the Western world, in my view, and I say this because almost everyone I've encountered and worked with in an ancestral capacity has this, and that is deep trauma in the lineage that is unprocessed, unresolved. And I think, one of the things that's really key about this, you asked about allyship and that mode of, let's say, recovery or restoration in the culture that we're in, or the non-culture. I think that why that's so key there is because there are traumas that have been inherited in European descended lineages, traumas that the Western world, as we normally frame it, holds and has been unable to process or adequately grieve. And so it has therefore become a dominator society, which is perpetrating those traumas in acts of aggression on other people. And so we could talk a lot about
Other
this
people
as it
being
relates to
people of color, y'all. Just that's
yeah.
Just want to make that clear.
Yeah. So as we might discuss colonialism, for example, I think there's a sense in which Westerners, and let's say, just to be a little more precise, let's say European descended folks have negated their own indigenous or ancestral inheritance. And this happened a long time ago. And that is a kind of violence to the self. It's a kind of violence to a cultural group to do that. It's the same kind of violence that we would see inflicted by one cultural group on another, where there's a cultural genocide happening and languages are destroyed and spiritual beliefs and ways of connecting to the landscape, all those things are negated and even in some cases utterly destroyed. And that's a huge violence, a huge trauma that I think in Western history has been carried forward and totally unprocessed. So that then when these European nations got a lot of power, and through scientism and other developmental stages of that cultural progression that we've seen in the West, I don't want to make it sound like it's a cultural evolution, because I think cultural evolutionism is an evil, that trope, that concept. But just that process of unfoldment that happened in Europe and through the Enlightenment, etc. Once the power was there to actually dominate other culture groups, other people groups, then that colonialism started happening, and the aggression started just coming one stage after another, one more horrible than the last. And I think partly what this indicates or points to, in my humble opinion, is an unprocessed root of trauma regarding self-negation or self-colonialization, if we want to use that framework. And once that's done, if it's not processed and grieved and worked through, not just in individual cases, but as a collective, as a cultural group, then that becomes basically self-hatred. And what happens if we take this into the realm of psychology, I think it's pretty straightforward to see what happens when somebody has unprocessed trauma and they go into self-hatred.
They project it out.
They project. They take that internal violence, and because they have no tools and no ability and no, in our case in the West, no cultural supports anymore for even understanding this, let alone actually processing and healing it, the violence just comes out and it gets transposed into the external world and enacted on other people. And there's a really interesting thing that happened in, like a chief example comes out of the birth of anthropology, actually, in British culture. and when Britain started colonizing, there was this whole thing that you've probably heard this phrase that grew out of that colonizing process culturally called the noble savage. This
I have
concept of the noble
not
savage.
heard that phrase. No. Will you define
So
it for us?
yeah, so it's basically the idea that these indigenous peoples that are being discovered, right? Discovered like they weren't there all along, you know, like
Some of the ways that you're framing it, and what I appreciate your framing for conversation's sake, but I am having to like temper all of my smart aleck remarks and all of my criticisms just to keep the conversation flowing.
Yeah.
So yes, when the indigenous cultures were discovered.
Right. So these people are discovered, right? And then they're basically approached as subhuman because of their perceived lack of cultural advancement, which is, I mean, it's to just use one term to try to express all of the feelings that I have about that. It's insane. It's totally insane. Right?
I'm gonna use the term "is fucked up."
Yeah, there you go.
Like what the fuck is wrong with you? Is how I feel.
Right. So this is what I'm saying though. In order for one culture to encounter another culture and have that view of them, I think there has to be a deep-seated unprocessed trauma. And there has to be a massive disconnection, a disconnection from self, a disconnection from other, a disconnection from the earth. All these modes of disconnection that we've perpetrated on ourselves in Western societies. Only that crazy, shitty matrix of experience can lead one into a place where they encounter another culture and say, these people aren't even human. You know, I mean, it's totally unfathomable, other than I think at least, if you think about it in terms of these deep-seated unprocessed traumas. So this idea though of the noble savage, which grew out of this period, was these less than fully human people that we're encountering, they do have a kind of noble quality about them. And there's something about their innocence, right? This is the kind of language that was used in these times, right? There's something about their innocence and their kind of naive spirituality or something like that we intuitively feel drawn to, but nonetheless, we're going to destroy them and try to replace their culture with ours. And I think there's a complex emotional thing happening there. It's totally unconscious. Well, I think part of what's happening in that dynamic is the oppressor sees instinctively, in a totally unconscious way, this is who, on some level, we used to be. We used to have these deep roots of connection to one another and to the land. And we did ourselves in by negating that in our own environments. We cut ourselves off from our versions of those indigenous ways of knowledge and wisdom. And because we can't process that, again, what happens? It becomes aggression, anger. So we're going to destroy these people. But simultaneously, we're going to lift them up as noble. Right? I mean, it's a totally, to use your phrase,
It sounds like gaslighting to me.
It's a totally fucked up dynamic, right? And it's a dynamic that I think had not been seen on the planet until this series of developments that we're talking about in European cultures.
So you seem to be pretty well versed in history. So in your opinion, or from your studies, what was the precipitating trauma? What's the unmetabolized trauma that allows for culture erasure?
I think actually it's a cascade of things, but I suspect that the first step was adopting this mentality and in some cases having this mentality enforced, that I'm going to say our, meaning European descended peoples for the time being, that our native ways of being were somehow evil or wrong, and that there was this foreign narrative coming out of the Near East through various arms of dominator culture at the time, out of Rome, etc. There was this narrative saying that there's one way to live rightly, and there's one way to believe, and there's one correct worldview. And everything that is not part of this worldview is essentially an evil. It's a negation of life. And so by taking that on and saying, yeah, we have to reject our own inherited ways of being that came to us over, thousands of generations of ancestral learning and wisdom, we have to scrap all of that and replace it with this foreign ideology that has been enforced on us as the one and only right ideology. And as we all know, maybe we don't all know this, but as I think is pretty evident, the Abrahamic faith traditions generally are not hospitable to non-Abrahamic faith traditions. So when a people group adopts something like that from the outside and says, okay, we're gonna hold
the monopoly on God.
Yeah, we're gonna hold this now as the one truth, and we're gonna accept the fact that everything that came before, and think about cultures where the ancestors are so central. Now suddenly the ancestors are throwaway because they had it all wrong. They were idiots. They didn't know what they were savages, just like these other people that we're encountering now, right? That aren't enlightened. So I'm projecting a little forward in history, but you can see the pattern there. So I think once you do that to yourself, then you're already programmed to do that to other people groups. If you don't consciously address that trauma and those resultant issues. And so I think that's really the root of it. But then it gets worse because then you get into materialism, philosophical materialism, later on down the line, Cartesian rationalism, scientism, the elevation of the human person through Abrahamic faiths and through the development of rationalistic science as central. The human person is suddenly the center of the cosmos, and the mind is the center of the cosmos, rather than, for example, the earth or a cosmic tree or these other common notions that are found in all native cultures all over the planet related to what the center of the universe is. So suddenly the center of the universe becomes the human person, then it's the mind, then it's white people, right? It's we who have the right answers because we're more culturally evolved. And long back in the past there is this unprocessed trauma related to how we got to that point.
Isn't it interesting though that the mind, the human, is the center just inherently, right? Like, oh, I exist, so I must be the center, as opposed to, like you said, a cosmic tree where everyone goes to get centered.
Yeah.
Seems like that would be a lot more centering, or more like the center,
yes,
the source of centering, as opposed to your awareness you exist.
Right. Amen.
In my traditions though, because we're speaking of metabolized trauma, and I was first introduced to this concept scholarly in a book called My Grandmother's Hands by Resma Menakem. And he talks about metabolized trauma and vicarious trauma that enslavement caused. And that enslavement is the dominator culture dehumanizes all cultures involved. And he shares a similar theory to you and myself, although mine just came straight through my moonbeam. Or my ancestors, of like, no, because I've had to heal or elevate in my beliefs some of my ancestors that have caused me trauma. So in doing that, how my connection to doing so had to do with the way that I experienced some emotions in my own body and choosing to sit with those emotions rather than react to them. And from sitting with them, I gained a deeper awareness that this pain isn't my pain, all of it.
Yeah.
That this pain, and then there were times that I would get a download that from a specific point in pain, and doing the work to add a resilience factor, if we take it back to epigenetics, which at some point, maybe I'll just take this point. Time out, y'all. So,
So say you have a clone or a secret identical twin, because you know that a twin or a clone is a genetically identical person to you, which is crazy, but it's true. Anyway, so you have this clone or your twin or what have you, and your parents decide that it's too much trouble to keep both of you. And so they give your clone to a kind of sketchy traveling circus. Now, I know your parents probably wouldn't actually do this, but just roll with me for a minute. So for the purposes of this example, let's just say that you grew up living a normal suburban American life, while your clone grew up with less stability and less access to nutritious food and less education, but more exercise and more access to sword swallowers and bearded ladies. And let's say you guys are 50 years old or whatever, you get together and have some lunch. So you're sitting there, across the table from your clone. What do you think you see? Well, for starters, Clone probably has a tattoo on its face. And if Clone had stayed in the circus, Clone probably, professionally rides a unicycle over a tightrope, so Clone is probably in pretty good shape. But then again, Clone probably smokes cigarettes and probably was malnourished as a child, so might be slightly shorter than you. By the same token, let's say that you've been eating Sonic tater tots 5 days a week since 1992, so you're looking a little bit tubby. Plus, you spent the last 20 years at a really stressful job that puts you at risk for all kinds of weird health complications. So, at 50, you and Clone would probably look pretty different from one another. But it turns out, you don't just look different, you actually have become different. Now, if some scientists looked at your genetic code, they would say that your DNA was still exactly the same as that of the person. That is to say, if your genome is a paragraph, all of the letters would be in the exact same order. But on another level, there would be a huge difference, and if we extend this metaphor, we can say that the letters are in the same order, but the spaces and the punctuation are all in different places. Of course, completely, potentially changing the message of that paragraph. The study of this genetic punctuation that I'm talking about is called epigenetics, which literally means above genetics. The epigenome doesn't change your DNA, but it decides how much or whether some genes are expressed in different cells in your body. Epigenetics looks at what happens to your genes over the course of your life, and whether those changes could be passed down to your children or even your grandchildren. So here's the way epigenetics works. You have billions of cells in your body, and they each contain your DNA, the same exact blueprint of your genetic code. But just because they have the DNA doesn't mean that they know what to do with it. They need outside instruction from these little carbon and hydrogen compounds called methyl groups. The way these methyl groups control the genome is by binding to a gene and saying, do not express this gene. The methyl groups bind differently to your genome in a skin cell versus, say, a tongue cell or an eyeball cell. And that is one of the ways that a cell knows that, hey, I'm a skin cell, or hey, I'm an eyeball cell, or hey, I'm a muscle cell. In addition to methyl groups, epigenetics is also controlled by histones, which are proteins that are basically the spools that DNA winds itself around. Histones can change how tightly or loosely the DNA is wound around them. If they're more loosely wound, the genes can express more, and if they're more tightly wound, then they express less. So whereas the methyl groups are more like a switch, the histones are more like a knob. Every cell in your body has a distinct methylation and histone pattern, and that is what gives every cell its marching orders. Think of your genome, the DNA, as the actual hardware of the computer, while the epigenome is more like the software, which tells the hardware what to do. The genome is what's going to be doing all the work, but the epigenome is going to be telling it what to do. So the hardware of your DNA is going to be the same throughout your entire life. But these epigenetic tags do change throughout your life, and they decide what genes get expressed or not. Now, epigenetic information in a cell isn't permanent. It can change throughout your life, and it can be hereditary. And it can change over time, especially when your body is going through a lot of changes, like, say, during puberty. A bunch of methyl groups kick in and they're like, okay, so you guys over here, you're gonna have to start growing hair, and you guys over here, I really need you guys to get behind giving this guy some really horrible acne. Or like when you get pregnant, which hopefully I won't, but when you do, your epigenome has to be like, alright guys, everything's about to get a whole lot bigger in here, and we're gonna have to pass something the size of like a Merriam-Webster's dictionary through that little pipe over there, so let's get this thing done. But it's not just these dramatic times when the epigenome is changing, it changes subtly throughout our entire lives. And it changes based on a lot of environmental factors, like what we do, what we eat, what we smoke, and how stressed out we are on a daily basis. Scientists have found that things like a bad diet can actually lead to methyl groups binding to the wrong place and making mistakes. And with those bad instructions, cells become abnormal and become a disease. And then basically all hell breaks loose and you get cancer or something. Epigenetics is a very young science, though we've known about the epigenome since the 1970s. It's only in the last 20 years that we've even known what effect these epigenetic tags are having on our DNA. And even after they got all that business straight, scientists still thought that all of our epigenetic tags were stripped off of our genome before they were passed on to our children. So if you started smoking 10 packs a day when you were 10 years old, that would certainly be a horrible health decision for you, but you wouldn't necessarily be harming your unborn children in any measurable way. However, the thinking on that is changing pretty rapidly, because it's true that a lot, even most of the epigenetic information from a parent is stripped off of the embryo's genome in the first few days, and fresh ones are created specifically for this new person. However, some of these tags get stuck on the genome and are passed down from generation to generation. And it just so happens that the more they study this, the more it looks like bad epigenetic information is being passed from generation to generation. And this is a whole new way to think about how we pass information between generations. Your grandmother was making dietary decisions that affect you today. As we experience all of these new strange epidemics, diabetes, autoimmune disorders, cancers, that weren't appearing in previous generations, it's starting to look like these may be caused by epigenetic information passed down from our parents. I know! It's such an unbelievable buzzkill! There is no point in our lives when we can do anything without guilt anymore. The discovery that the environmental factors the parent experiences can be passed down from generation to generation was sparked in the 1980s. And this happened when some scientists were looking at the birth and death records of some people who lived in 19th century Sweden. As is a weird place to find a genetic revolution, but there it is. It wasn't just any place in Sweden. It was in Norrbotten, which is the northernmost county in Sweden, which is literally in the Arctic Circle. And despite the fact that Norrbotten was literally the worst place you could possibly choose to live in Sweden, there were some people living there in the 1800s. And they were completely cut off from the rest of the world. Let me clarify. These people were isolated. Like, if they didn't have a good crop year, people died. No, it wasn't ideal, but, you know, they didn't ask me my opinion, so I'm not giving it. So anyway, these people subsisted entirely on what they grew and the animals that they raised. And like I said, sometimes they starved. But sometimes they had huge, bountiful years of plenty. And when it happened, people totally went ape crackers. I mean, of course they did, because they were so freaking hungry, and then all of a sudden there was all this damn food everywhere. Anyway, there was a public health specialist who was looking at the effects of the people who grew up in the really bad starving periods of time versus the people who grew up in the eat all you can at the smorgasbord years. And you might already be guessing what they found out. People who went from relatively slim pickings to feed your face until you have to barf and then do it all over again in a single season, those people died an average of 6 years sooner than their starved out counterparts. And you know what sucks? So do their kids. And so do their kids' kids. Boo epigenetics. So, of course, now we all know, and we're all going to stop doing unhealthy things starting today. Unless the damage is already done. The damage is almost certainly already done. But hey, epigenetics brings good tidings along with bad ones. For instance, we now know that certain types of cancer are caused by misplaced epigenetic tags, and scientists are now developing drugs that can silence the bad genes that were supposed to be turned off in the first place. Additionally, until recently, we thought that genes were the end-all and be-all of who you got to be. They were your blueprint, and you couldn't escape them. This outlook is not just kind of depressing, it also leads to a yucky sort of social prejudice. Because when you look at data without considering social and epigenetic factors, it might look like people with less money are less intelligent. So just like 15 years ago, there were scientists saying things in public, mind you, like some people just have good genes for intelligence, and it just so happens that the poor people don't. Oh, it's so sad. Too bad, poor people. But you have bad genes. Well, it turns out that that is not even a little bit true. Not only are there a huge variety of social factors that affect how well people do on intelligence tests, but a genetic trait is also not just a product of genes, it's also a product of environment. Any one person's genome is determined by any number of decisions made by any number of their ancestors. And right now, you are making decisions that are going to affect people who are alive long after you were dead. No pressure or anything. And so I'm glad you've watched this, because when you and your clone are in your 60s, and you sit down, have lunch, and he brings his son, and his son has a tattoo on his face, he did not inherit that from you.
To bring it back, now that we have a basic understanding of how epigenetics plays out in our history and in our today and in our now, doing that work to elevate my ancestors and doing that work to process makes me feel like a more whole person, makes me have more compassionate responses. It makes unity, love, and connection my more natural trigger of reaction. It made me decide that I wanted to become a more kind person. I didn't want to take out my anger through vengeance or vindictiveness because it didn't work. It just left me feeling actually in more of a victim state, because the only reason I needed to be vengeful and vindictive is because I felt powerless and I wanted to regain my power. But I was really giving whoever harmed me the power to have harmed me by saying how shitty they were and that they should be punished. Because that was in my own psychological time that I was feeling like, oh, they are so terrible and I'm so stupid for whatever those stories played out. So in doing that work with myself, I feel like I've been able to establish more of a connection with my ancestors. How do you see that playing out in Eurocentric people, or like, so if there's been such an extreme culture erasure, what do you see as the solution?
Yeah, great question. I also, by the way, would love to hear more about your process of working with the ancestors and of accessing those lineages and healing some of that trauma. So let's talk about that too. But just to answer your question, and I'll try to be as succinct as possible. It's a big question, but I think there are several approaches that have to be taken simultaneously. One, we always begin from where we are, right? So we can't, it makes no sense to be anachronistic and to wish for some different history than the one that we actually have, and to try to go outside of this time and contrivedly bring some other time into being here and now. It just doesn't work. So I think being realistic about what we've inherited, where we are, and the constructs that we have, and then doing two things simultaneously. One, finding the threads in the constructs we currently have, for example, in the church, in Catholic Christianity in the West, finding the little threads in there, like we were talking about earlier, that do actually carry a stream of ancestral wisdom that is not 100% traumatized. I mean, it's largely traumatized, but we need to get in there and find the bits that aren't traumatized and capitalize on those, so to speak, and pull out that wisdom and follow those threads back as far as we can. Then the other thing that I think we need to do simultaneous to that is go back to the really, really ancient ancestors and to what we have left of our mythic and folkloric traditions. And this, by the way, I think is recommendable for all people. It doesn't matter who you are on the planet. Like, I think we're at a state now where dominator culture and the socioeconomic norms of dominator culture in the West have so saturated the world and have destroyed so many cultural environments that, like, almost everyone now needs to do this work to some degree. It's just that the Western peoples need to do it more probably than anybody else. But I think everybody needs to do it to some degree. To go back to the ancient ancestors, what are the surviving myths that we have? What are the folk tales? What are the customs and traditions that go back before the adoption of Christianity and before all these unhealthful patterns began? And pull those forward in an intelligent, meaningful, non-anachronistic way, right? So not in a silly way. Like, anachronistic means doing something that is awkwardly drawn from a past time, basically. So you know, like if you think about the Renaissance fair or role playing or something like that, where people try to put on a costume of some former time because they're nostalgic for a time that they never knew, right? At least in this lifetime. And so not doing that, and by the way, I'm not saying that, you know, people shouldn't go to the Renaissance Fair or whatever, that's fine, but not taking that kind of approach, which is ultimately fairly silly by comparison to what we need to do. The work we need to do is serious work. And so going back and intelligently, with intellective veracity and with respect and integrity, beginning to bring back some of these customs and traditions and ask how they might really fit into our world now, and make the constructs we do have vulnerable to revision from the reclamation of those earlier things, if that makes sense.
What I heard you say was the more that people build connection with their heritage in whatever small way possible, because of so much culture erasure, the less we'll have these racialized societies and dominator culture.
I think that's partly true. I also think it's important, though, to be clear that when we're talking about cultural reclamation, we're talking about something that's transcendent of race. So it's not a racial issue per se, it's a cultural issue. And so I don't think, for instance, to illustrate what I mean, so in America, right, most white people in America, not all certainly, but most, have some often untraceable admixture of lineages in a genetic or racial sense, right? Like if you ask people, oh, what's your ancestral origins or what have you, then they'll say, oh, I don't know. I mean, I think I'm German and English and a little bit Swedish and Spanish, and there's a little African in there, and there's some Native American, you know, like it's a melange, right? It's so diversified. And that's okay. But what I think we need to avoid and be careful to guard against in this reclamation work is people saying like, oh, well, you know, you can't, for example, if I said, as somebody rooted in my own ancestral cultures, which are Celtic, I'm, I guess, in a way fortunate that I have very clear lineages that are Scottish, Irish, and Welsh, and really nothing else, like that much Swedish, and that's it, you know. But if I said, for example, to somebody who has German heritage, no, you can't be part of what I'm doing because you're not Celtic, you're German. That's not the way. That's not how we need to proceed. I think we need to ask broader questions about, you know, different modes of European cultural inheritance, and ask at a soul level where people are feeling drawn in this reclamation work. And it may be that, you know, somebody who has no relationship to in fact, this often occurs, somebody who has no relationship in a physical or racial sense to my particular ancestral inheritance feels really drawn at a soul level into Celtic cultures and traditions. And I welcome them in with open arms in that case, right? So I think it's important that we're not drawing racial lines.
I had a client who had some Celtic ancestors that wouldn't leave me alone for trying to get them to connect with them, like, you know. And every time I would see this client, it was like, did you connect with them yet? And they're like, no, I haven't got it, because they keep bothering me, and now they're telling you it'll be bad for you if you don't. But I had that happen as an experience, and for me, with my moonbeam, if I'm not paying, so I'm claircognizant, meaning that I just know stuff. So if I'm not paying attention to the feeling and insight that comes along with the thought, it could be just another thought and gone away. But when I'm being present to the feeling and the insight that comes along with it, that's what, so there's this trust that what I'm saying has value that has to come up. but there was repeated like Celtic, please connect. They really want you. And she was a Black woman.
Mm. Yeah. And yeah, so that's, I mean, and those things happen for various reasons. I think because of the genetic lineages that are there sometimes, and also for metaphysical reasons that we can't limit and really rationally frame, right? Because we don't necessarily have the adequate understanding to speak to those things. I mean, who am I to say what someone's soul lineage is? I mean, that's, you know, it's in my worldview. In my worldview, incarnation is just, or excuse me, I'll use the proper metaphysical term, transmigration of souls. So the appearance of souls in many different forms, in many different worlds over a potentially infinite amount of time. That's a given in my ancestral worldview. So my assumption is, who the hell knows what people's soul lineages are, and they may be connected to various tribes of souls, councils of ancestors that, you know, I share in, for example, even if they are not related at all to my ancestral lineages in this particular incarnation. So I think we have to always be mindful of that level of things as well, and not fall into the trap of getting caught up in racial designations and, you know, drawing lines in the sand around those kinds of things. I think that's also an important part. I teach online, and I'm in fact launching some new courses through my website, which is brendanelliswilliams.com.
We'll put that in the comments.
Okay, yeah. So I'm launching some new courses coming up pretty soon. One 1st of September, one 15th of September. One is a course that's in basically Celtic folklore and myth, and asking how those things can relate to our contemporary reclamation of ancestral inheritance and to living more sustainably on the land, issues of ecology, questions around meaning, existential questions. So what can we draw from these ancient mythic and folkloric traditions and practices and customs to inform our pursuit of answers to those questions? Then the other course is a 5-month course. The first course is only 4 weeks. The second one is 5 months, and it's a course on animism or animistic spirituality, which is, in brief, it's the worldview which acknowledges that everything in the natural creation is alive, and everything has a soul or a consciousness, and we can and should relate to all those things that are in our environment. So how do we do that? And how do we do that in a way that's not culturally appropriative? And how do we do that in a way that is moral, ethical, and that actually integrates into our contemporary lifestyles? So that's that course. And then folks should just kind of pay attention, because I mean, that sounds weird, but hey, pay attention. No, I don't mean it that way, but I mean, just watch out for things that I'm doing, because I've got a lot of stuff in the mix, a lot of stuff brewing right now. So, and also folks can and should, if they feel so inclined, read my book, which deals with some of the issues that we talked about today. And it's called it's called Seeds from the Wild Verge: Myth, Nature, and Theology in the Border Stream of Celtic Wisdom. And you can buy it on Amazon and wherever. I think it's probably, I don't know what's happened with the distribution, but I think it's probably available on Barnes and Noble and other stuff like that now. But it's definitely on Amazon. And if you don't want to support Amazon, or you don't want to support big business like that online, you can contact me and I can get you a copy of the book directly too. So
how they can contact you on Facebook or on social media?
Yeah,
You through
on
your
Facebook
website
or through email. So on my website, there's a contact page. That's a really easy way to get in touch with me, and folks can contact me there for any questions, or if they're desiring to find out more about a course or any of that.
Go ahead and give them the website one more time.
Okay, it's brendanelliswilliams.com. all one word, BRENDANELLISWILLIAMS.com.
Okay, just because some people aren't going to check the comments or anything like
Yeah,
that.
sure.
And so I just want to say thank you so much, first, for acknowledging history the way that I've learned history, for making sure we know that Christ is not Jesus's last name, and that it is a power, and that the Bible, King James Bible, not so accurate. For that alone, Brandon, you get invited to the cookout, and maybe I'll tell you what that means after we get off the call. Sorry. Thank you guys for watching. This will be a part 1 and part 2. So hold on. So guys, it's looking like we're gonna have to make this I said guys, sorry, that's an ally blunder. Listen folks, we're gonna have to make this a 2-part interview because we have so much juicy meat here. So I just wanna, we're gonna separate this. I just wanna make sure I thank Brendan for all of his knowledge and for being willing to give us so much knowledge that we have to make 2 parts. So Brendan, do you have anything to say to the Ask Alexa?